This is our answer to Exam 2, Section D, Pulp Fiction. Explore how far your chosen films or films are experimental in challenging conventional approaches to narrative. 20 marks. Pulp Fiction to a cineast wouldn't be considered an experimental film, but to a mainstream audience, it would have an experimental narrative. For example, films such as Enter the Void, directed by Gaspar Noé, and Irreversible, also directed by Noé, are much more experimental. In terms of narrative, Irreversible was filmed so that the ending is at the beginning of the film, which is effective as it gives the audience a sense of dramatic irony running throughout the film. Similarly, Pulp Fiction doesn't have a linear structure, and to a mainstream audience who are used to chronological structures of Hollywood cinema, Pulp Fiction would have seemed experimental.
Forget it, it's too risky. I'm through doing that shit.
You always say that, the same thing every time. I'm through, never again, too dangerous.
The film opens in a diner with Pumpkin and Honey Bunny. This sets an audience up for a narrative about these two characters, but instead it cuts to the credits of Jules and Vincent in the car. This is effective because it forces an audience to be active spectators and engages with the film. It is also effective because in the first couple of scenes, Tarantino is setting up and introducing all the characters. The narrative isn't linear, but this allows an audience to become engaged with the characters. Tarantino creates an enigma code through a non-linear narrative, keeping the audience focused.
Pulp Fiction could also be considered as experimental through Tarantino's use of dialogue. Throughout the film, the characters talk about pop culture and mainstream trends. For example, at the beginning of the film, Jules and Vincent talk about McDonald's and go on to discuss this for quite a long time.
But you know the funniest thing about Europe is?
What?
It's the little differences. I mean, they got the same shit over there that they got here, but it's just there, it's a little different.
Example?
All right, well, you can walk into a movie theater in Amsterdam and buy a beer. And I don't mean just like no paper cup, I'm talking about a glass of beer. And in Paris, you can buy a beer in McDonald's. And you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
Oh, man, they got the metric system. They wouldn't know what the fuck a quarter pounder is.
And what do they call it?
They call it Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
What do they call a Big Mac?
Big Mac's a Big Mac, but they call it Le Big Mac.
Le Big Mac. What do they call a Whopper?
I don't know, I didn't go on a Burger King.
This is effective because it engages a mainstream audience and would be viewed as experimental because the conversation has no relevance to the plot or narrative of the film. It also is effective as it helps the mainstream audience to relate with the characters and connect with the plotline.
Tarantino himself said that he's been influenced by lots of different filmmakers, and he merges a variety of different old traditional stories together to create a narrative. For example, he has 3 different plotlines: Vincent taking Mia out, Vincent and Jules going on a job, and Butch winning the match and playing Marcellus Wallace. All 3 storylines are considered traditional and usually told in a linear way. The fact that Tarantino tells 3 stories disjointed and flips between the 3 stories adds to the experimental nature of the film.
Overall, to a mainstream audience, Pulp Fiction could be considered as experimental.
In the bag. What's in the case?
My boss's dirty laundry.
The fact the film ends in the same setting as the beginning is effective because an audience can see a clear connection between the beginning and the end and still be left with the mindset that they have watched an experimental film because it wasn't told in a linear fashion. Tarantino mixes the genres of crime and a spaghetti western to create a new take on old traditions, which therefore becomes experimental.
And that got the full 20 marks.
Meow!